Okay, welcome back. We have been talking about the Ozarks after the Civil War, and the last couple of presentations, we've been talking about just how really crazy it was in the Ozarks after the Civil War. A depopulated area that resorted to barter instead of money. It was just really not a fun time. Well, that all began to change in the 1870s, and it really picked up momentum in the 1880s because because of the coming of the railroad. The railroad absolutely changed the complexion of the Ozarks, and it actually made Springfield. I mean, Springfield was already the biggest town in the Ozarks, but when I say that, you're talking a few thousand. Now, of course, it's way over 250,000 metropolitan area, and it got up to close to 50,000 by the turn of the century. So it really grew really rapidly, and that all had to do with the coming of the Frisco Railroad. It's actually the name of it was the St. Louis to San Francisco Railroad, but everybody around here calls it the Frisco. And if you lived in the Ozarks, I know this is not anything new to you. The Frisco Railroad just dominated the Ozarks as far as transportation for many, many years until it finally merged with the Burlington Northern in the 1970s. And eventually that merged with the Santa Fe, and now, of course, it's the BNSF. But it's still there. By the way, good story about the Frisco logo up here. A lot of people don't realize how that logo came about. What happened was the Frisco executives had built a new hotel down in Eureka Springs, where they had this is the railroad, and they had built the Crescent Hotel. I'm sure some millions have probably been there. And when they went down there for a meeting, the president of the railroad, they were trying to come up with a better logo. They just weren't satisfied with the way it looked, for a marketing tool. Even in the 1880s, they were thinking about things like this. So happened the railroad went by a log cabin. It's still a very rural area. And on the side of the log cabin was a coon skin. The guy had killed a raccoon and stretched the skin out. And he looked at it and he said, "That's our logo right there." And they ended up going back and getting their, I don't know what they called them then, they're called graphic artists now, to make up a logo of a stretched out coonskin with the words Frisco imprinted in the middle of it. And that became the logo of the Frisco Railroad for then on. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, the Ozarker of note. This man played an important part in the coming of the Frisco Railroad. And we've already talked about him a couple of times. He was a judge during the Wild Bill Hickok trial, and he was also the defense attorney for the ball knobbers that we just talked about. So we've talked about him in the last two sessions. His name is Sempronius Pony Boyd, and he had a lot to do with the placement of the Frisco Railroad and the rail yards in Springfield. And of course, Springfield became the hub of the Frisco Railroad. It's where the corporate offices were and the rail yards and the repair shops. I mean, it just was huge in Springfield for many, many decades. So let's kind of look back at the history of the railroad real fast. Of course, the railroad came to the United States very early in the 1830s, and it brought with it this new era of industrialization. This is the age of industrialism. And I can't think of anything that had more to do with creating this era of industrialism in the world, really, than the railroad. It particularly had an impact upon the United States, because as you well know, the United States is one of the largest countries in the world, area-wise. And as a result, they really, it was really important. It provided rapid and cheap transportation, giving rise to the economic boom of the last part of the 19th century and clear into the 20th century. The railroad, folks, the coming of the railroad probably had more to do with the transition of the United States into an industrialized country than anything else. That's just, that's not a hyperbole. You might ask yourself, how were these railroads built? Because they were extremely expensive to build. Well, as we're going to see in a few minutes, they were built primarily through the process of land grants. They were given grants of land, particularly in the western part of the United States, by the government. And they basically said, in return for building these railroad lines, we will give you a certain amount of acreage along each side of it for you to sell. And of course, that's where the towns came in. I mean, I don't know what the number is, but I'm going to guess that probably anywhere from 75 to 85% of most of the towns in the western part of the United States were there because of the railroad. That's just all there is to it. I mean, again, that's not a hyperbole. If you weren't on the railroad, you died out pretty rapidly. Just like later on, if you weren't on the interstate highway system, you sometimes died out. So this is the first railroad locomotive in the United States. This is the DeWitt Clinton, ran from Albany to Schenectady at an amazing rate of 7 miles an hour. I could outrun that thing. Even at my age, I think I could walk faster than 7 miles an hour. If you'll notice, it actually pulled stagecoach. The first cars were not even cars. They were stagecoaches that they hooked up. And it burned coal. Actually, it wasn't a wood burner. Most of them were wood burners for a long time, and then they converted later on to coal. But the first one was actually a coal-driven locomotive. By the way, this is now in the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, if you've ever been there, the great museum. So let's talk a little bit how the FRISCO came about. Well, it was all kind of came about as a result of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, the Transcontinental Railroad was a railroad that was built to connect basically the Midwest, Missouri, Illinois, Iowa, with the western part of the United States, primarily because of the gold rush. You might know your history. You know that there was a big gold rush in 1849 in the western part of the United States. And as a result of that, they decided to have a convention in that year in St. Louis to discuss building a railroad to stretch clear across the western part of the United States. And during this convention, there was a significant interest in it. And they finally decided that they were going to build what was called the Boston Plan. There were actually 3 proposed routes. There was one running across the northern part of the United States. There was one running down the southern part of the United States, and there was one running kind of in the middle, kind of following the old Lewis and Clark path for some time. That was one that was ended up being chosen, and it was called the Boston Plan, kind of roughly followed the Oregon Trail for a while. So here's the path. You can see it started in Omaha, and the terminus, of course, was Sacramento, and they had already built a railroad between San Francisco and Sacramento. The red part is the Central Pacific Railroad, which was built by primarily 4 very rich men in the western part of the United States and California, men like Stanford, and some of these guys you maybe have recognized the names. This is the Union Pacific Railroad, and it was built, of course, it's a lot longer than this part, but that's because it was primarily plains. They did have to cross over the Rockies, but they used primarily the South Pass, and it wasn't as hard to get across. The Central Pacific had to cross the Sierra Nevadas, and that was almost impossible to do. In fact, it got to the point where the railroad gangs refused to try to build it because they had to literally tunnel through the Sierra Nevada mountains. And so they walked off because they wanted to go to the gold fields anyway and hunt for gold. That was when the Central Pacific brought in railroad gangs of Chinese laborers, and the Chinese ended up building primarily this red part of the railroad. This part was built primarily by Irish road gangs. the great influx of Irish immigrants in the United States, in the middle part of the United States in the mid 1800s. And they provided labor primarily to build the Union Pacific. They met at a place outside of Salt Lake City called Promontory Point. There's a good story about Promontory Point. Since they got paid for however many miles of track they laid, they actually were about 40 miles apart and were building apart from each other. And the government had to step in and say, guys, you've got to meet. You can't just keep doing this. So they end up having to build together. They reached that. And of course, that's the big story is the Golden Spike. You've seen, I bet everyone you've seen the photograph where the two railroad cars are connected up, locomotives are meeting head on, and they've stopped and they're pounding in the Golden Spike. By the way, the Golden Spike is now in Stanford University. Leland Stanford is one of the big four that built the Central Pacific, and he got one of the Golden Spikes. There was more than one. Also, a big story about this that most of the movers and shakers had partied so hard the night before they were all drunk in the railroad cars. Ended up being a bunch of the Irish and the Chinese road gangs that had to hammer in the Golden Spike. Some real good books written about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, two of the biggest men involved in building Transcontinental Railroad was, first of all, John C. Fremont. He was big in that it was his path, it was his trail that he kind of blazed that ended up being the route of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, if you know anything about John C. Fremont, he was kind of like the Kardashians. He was kind of famous for being famous. He did a lot of things, and he was one of the most famous men in the United States in the 1850s. Actually, was the first presidential candidate for the Republican Party in 1856. Almost won. He was almost president of the United States. In reality, it seemed like everything he touched was gold for him, but fell apart in the long run. Interesting man, if you ever get a chance to read something about him. The political mover and shaker happened to be his father-in-law. He had married the daughter of Thomas Hart Benton, not the painter. That was a nephew that came later. This is the original Thomas Hart Benton, who was a senator from Missouri, who was probably the most powerful senator in the United States in the 1850s. And he was one of the big promoters of the Transcontinental Railroad because it crossed Missouri and had a lot to do with it. So these two guys had a lot to do with building the Transcontinental Railroad. The route that was eventually chosen, and they laid out all sorts of lines and spurs, including one that ran through southwest Missouri. And so they began building this railroad in March of 1849. And the U.S. government granted a charter to the Missouri Pacific Railroad, which ran from St. Louis to Kansas City. This was the first railroad in Missouri that ran from the two big terminuses on each side of the state. It also called for a southwestern spur to be built along the old Osage Trace down through the southwestern part of the state. It got built as far as Rolla. And then the Civil War came about and the railroad had to stop being built. It wasn't taken back up until 1868, 1869, and they began to rebuild this spur down through southwest Missouri. So this is a picture of Thomas Hart Benton, the senator, and this is the old pathfinder, John C. Fremont. He plays a part in the Frisco Railroad for a few years, so kind of pay attention to him. So I talked about how the railroads got their money. I want to go into that a little bit more. 1862, the government passed a series of land grant acts, giving the railroads land in exchange for building rail lines. For every 1 mile of track laid, the railroad received 6 square miles of land. That's almost 17,000 acres. So for every line of track, every mile of track, they got 3 square miles basically on either side of the railroad line. And you can go to any little town in the western part of the United States where the railroad came through, and you can go to somebody's house that built along the railroad, and along, I'm talking 2 or 3 miles. And if you go back and look at the old abstract of title, which they used to have, my little house in Republic was built about a mile from the railroad. And I remember looking at the abstract of title when they built the house. And sure enough, the original owner of the land was the St. Louis to San Francisco Railroad. And so, this was very $16,000 mile of track at very generous interest rates. So, folks, it was a wealthy production. It was a very wealthy thing to build a railroad. You got a lot of money. The railroads eventually got over 200 million acres of land to build the railroad in the western part of the United States. And every bit of that land they turned around and sold, for the most part, to people wanting to settle along the railroad. Why the railroads were so financially beneficial to build. I mean, it was great for these guys, and these guys made just tons of money. You think back at some of the big names involved in railroad building in the 1800s, particularly the Vanderbilts. And the Vanderbilts were so wealthy, they didn't know how much money they had. I was just talking before we started. They built summer cottages in Newport, Rhode Island. I bet some of you have been there. And these little summer cottages are some of the most magnificent houses you've ever seen in your life. That was not their main residence. That was their summer houses. That whole thing is quite a story in its own right. So here was kind of the outline of the land grants, as you can see, through all these railroads that were built in the western part of the United States. And you see down here that the yellow, this was on each side. Here's the railroad track. And they had 100 yards right of way, which was given directly to the railroad. And then there was 3 square miles of land on either side. And it alternated. The red blocks were given directly to the railroad to sell. The yellow blocks, square miles, were given to the government to set up to basically give out as homesteads. So you can see that this was just a very lucrative thing to build a railroad. So just think about this. 1870, railroad starts coming down through Southwest Missouri. Folks, there was almost nothing in Southwest Missouri. There were a few big towns, and when I'm talking big towns, I'm talking no more than a few thousand people. Warsaw was one of the earliest ones, 1826, on the Osage River. Springfield was founded in 1830. Fayetteville, 1837. Osceola, 1838. Of course, Osceola got pretty much destroyed during this raid and during the Civil War. Rolla in 1858. Folks, that was the big towns in the Ozarks. Other than those, you didn't have very many towns in the Ozarks. There were villages, there were settlements. People sometimes built 2 or 3 houses around the same area. They had a mill, maybe by the river, but for the most part, there were not towns. You just didn't see those, except for these. And every one of these, particularly Rolla and Fayetteville and Springfield and Warsaw, all became very important because of the railroad. After the railroad come through, there were just hundreds of towns. For instance, if you look at Springfield, if you take the railroad west of Springfield, you go, first of all, the first stop was Nichols Junction, which is now inside the city of Springfield. And then there was a stop at Brookline. And then there was a stop at Republic. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. This is the old railroad depot at Republic, which is the little town I grew up in. And then you went to Billings. And then you went to Marionville. And then you went to Aurora, Monette, Pierce City, on and on. All the way down to the southwestern point where you went into Oklahoma. About every 5 miles, you had a depot. You know why 5 miles? Because that was about the extent that a person could travel at that time during pulling a wagon. If you lived on a farm and you needed to go to town, you could start off in the morning and drive to town and do your business and get back in time to take care of your animals and whatever, and before it got dark. And that was about the extent. On top of that, the railroads needed to take on water about every 5 to 7 miles. So that's the reason that towns like Republic sprung up. Republic, just let me give you this was duplicated in thousands of communities all over the United States. Prior to coming to Frisco Railroad, Republic didn't even exist. It was just a small settlement of farms and a general store. And the railroad wasn't even going to stop there. And 3 men got together and said, hey, if you will stop, we will build you a depot. You won't have to build a depot. We'll finance it and build it ourselves. Well, that was too good for the railroad to turn down. They thought, hey, these guys want to build us a depot, fine. So they end up building that depot I just showed you the picture of. By 1900, there were over 1,000 citizens in the little town of Republic, and it was home to the biggest soft flour mill west of the Mississippi at that day and time, the R.C. Stone flour mill, run 24 hours a day. That was all because of the railroad. And look here, this is a picture of the R.C. Stone milling company that was taken around 1900. 30 years prior to that, that town hadn't even existed. And again, folks, that story can be told thousands of times all over the western part of the United States. So the Missouri Pacific Railroad, as I said, was built between St. Louis and Kansas City. It was finally completed about 1860. And the Southwestern Spur was completed through Raleigh, as I've said, when the Civil War started in 1861. It was postponed until 1867 after the war. That's when John C. Fremont, the old Pathfinder, purchased the rights to what was then the St. Louis to San Francisco Railroad. He was going to be a railroad millionaire. The only trouble is, folks, he didn't have the slightest idea about how to run a railroad. And within about 18 months, he absolutely had lost everything. And even though he had acquired massive land grants and right-of-ways, he absolutely was a horrible businessman. The result was he went bankrupt and had to sell the railroad out to a bunch of Boston, Massachusetts speculators. And they came in and took over. And this is kind of the railroad map of Missouri in the latter part of the 1900s. Now, the blue here is the Missouri Pacific Railroad. As you can see, after they built the line to Kansas City, they started building all these other spurs all over the place. This is the Frisco, this red line here. And it was built down to Raleigh, and then they continued building on the way down to Springfield and all the way down into Oklahoma. Eventually, they built the spur down to Fayetteville. They built a spur up to Polk County around Bolivar. They built the spur to Chadwick to get the timber they needed for the railroad ties. And then eventually they merged with this yellow railroad. And I'm not for sure what the name of that railroad was, but it eventually merged with they ended up buying that spur, and it went to the southeastern part of Missouri and eventually became part of the line that ran all the way down to the coast, taking oil with it from the Oklahoma oil fields in the 1900s. So this kind of gives you an idea of the railroad map of Missouri by around 1900. Pretty extensive, as you can see. The areas down here, not a lot of railroads because, frankly, it just wasn't land to build a railroad on. The main railroad ran that way, and then you had a lot of railroads out here because of the lead mines around Joplin, and you had the big line that moved up to Kansas City, and the one that moved down to Fayetteville, and of course on out into the western part of the western part of Oklahoma and down into Texas. That became the Frisco line. So the railroad, which became now known as the Frisco, had a 50-year cycle of boom and bust. Some years it went great, some years it just was horrible. By 1876, the Frisco completely separated from the Missouri Pacific Railroad. It was part of the Missouri Pacific Railroad originally, and then they separated. At this time, the Frisco began a large-scale expansion that included the spurs I just talked to you about: Springfield to Kansas City, Cuba to Salem, Pierce City to Joplin, Springfield to Memphis, Memphis to Pensacola. And here's a typical railroad gang that you would have seen. I can remember as a child. I grew up by the side of the tracks. I always laugh. I don't know if I was on the wrong side or the right side, but I definitely grew up within about a quarter of a mile of the railroad tracks. And I mean, I got so used to hearing railroad trains coming through at all hours of the day. When I finally went to college and there was no railroad around, I hardly could sleep because I was so used to hearing the trains come through at every hour of the night and day that, I guess subconsciously I was listening for the trains, and I couldn't sleep for a long time. It took me a while to get used to not hearing the trains, but I can remember these railroad gangs coming through and to rebuild the tracks on the occasional basis. I can tell you all sorts of stories. That depot I just showed you at Republic, that was one of my playgrounds. I used to hang around there, watch the trains come in as a young child. And it's just a typical small town existence. This is a better map of the Frisco Railroad at its height. And you can see, again, when it brought into all these other little railroads, and you can see it all the way down south of Dallas, all the way to Pensacola, all the way out to the oil fields of Texas and the oil fields in Oklahoma, all the way out to Wichita, up to Ellsworth. So this was the extent of the Frisco Railroad. Now, there's a good story about the coming of the railroad in Springfield. Springfield was on the original 1852 survey of the railroad. When they laid out this railroad plan, we were on the original one. And as I've told you, the outbreak of the Civil War stopped it from being built. But by 1870, it was coming to Springfield. What happened was this. The original charter stated the railroad had to run through Springfield. Now, the problem is the survey placed it a mile north of the city. This probably happened more often than not, because what happened was this. The railroad lawyer showed up, and he basically asked for a bribe. And he said, you either pay me $25,000 to run the railroad down through the middle of Springfield, or I'm going to place it somewhere else. And basically, the lawyer for the city of Springfield, a man by the name of C.B. Holland, who was a pretty big guy in the late 1800s in Springfield, told this Andrew Pierce, the lawyer, said, we're not doing that. You're not getting a bribe from us. And so he said, fine, we'll just build the railroad north of town. Just so happened that three men, Pony Boyd, a man by the name of Irwin Robertson, who, if you're familiar with Springfield, that's a name you probably hear a lot, and a man by the name of Charles Harwood. He's not as well known as these other two. They had kind of got wind of what was going on. They were pretty intuitive, and they ended up buying a lot of the land north of Springfield. And sure enough, that's where the railroad came through. And you can use your imagination if they end up bribing the guy or not. That's up to you. The railroad was in place 1 mile north of the city, which was on the original survey. This is the first engine into Springfield. And you can see this is the Atlantic and Pacific is what it was called then. Later on, it came to the Missouri Pacific. But that's the first railroad engine coming into Springfield. Someone took a picture of it. And so the problem was it was not in Springfield. But that's where all the business sprung up, because wherever the railroad was, everybody wanted to be right on the railroad. So when it arrived on April 21st, it signaled a new era. And that new era was the rise of a separate town. Most people that live in Springfield have no idea that the north part of Springfield once was a separate town called North Springfield. By the way, the locals called it Moon City because it was a satellite that circled the Earth. In other words, it was like the moon to Springfield, the South Springfield. The trouble was, for North Springfield was actually a bigger business district than the main town. It actually was growing faster and more cosmopolitan and industrial than was the old town of Springfield. Commercial Street, again, if you're familiar with Springfield, Commercial Street was the primary business center of Springfield in these days. It was located in North Springfield. Eventually, the two towns got together. They finally merged in 1887 because both sides realized that this was just stupid to continue this fight about, being two separate towns. So they finally got together in 1887. Didn't quite end the rivalry, because when they decided to build a new courthouse and a new federal building, they had to build it in between the two towns. And if you're familiar with Springfield, you know that the old federal building, which is now the old city hall in Springfield, and the new courthouse was built about halfway between the square and Commercial Street. By the way, there is a street running through that area that's called Division Street. That was the dividing line between North Springfield and the city of Springfield. And here's a map of the two cities right here. A map of the city of Springfield, North Springfield, 1878, showing you here's the railroad and all the Commercial Street and all the rail yards and all. And here's the city of Springfield. Down here is the square. So you can see that, it was quite the deal. Here is Commercial Street that was built at this time, and it was a booming area, folks, and still was up until about the 1940s, 50s. Then it started to go downhill. Now Commercial Street has been revitalized, and it's a big arts district, and a lot of urban renewal going on in the Commercial Street area today, and it's kind of really a good place to shop. This is the rail yards in Springfield at the time. Folks, this was a big operation. We're talking, this was the hub of this whole railroad that spans throughout all of Missouri and Texas and Oklahoma and clear down to Florida up into Kansas. This is where the corporate offices were located. This is where the rail yards were. This was where the repair shops. It was a multi-million-dollar business, and it brought with it just thousands of well-paying jobs to Springfield. I can guarantee you, if you worked in the railroad and, you had one of the better jobs in Springfield. I had an uncle who was the rich man of the family. My family didn't have very many people that had very much money, but he was on my mother's side. Uncle Herschel, I'm going to tell you his last name, but Uncle Herschel lived over on West Walnut Street, and he was a boilermaker at the Frisco Railroad, and he had a really nice big home, big 2-story, almost like a Victorian house, and they drove fancy new cars. They were the rich people of the family, and they associated with us and all, but still, yet it was always it was obvious that they were the ones that had the money in the family, and it was all because he worked at the railroad. The original depot was located on Commercial Street. Eventually, they bought that rail line that I showed you in yellow that ran from Kansas City down, and they eventually built that. And that's when they end up building the railroad depot in downtown Springfield. And again, if you're familiar with downtown Springfield, you probably kind of have an idea where the main depot lay. It was about 3 blocks northwest of the square. And this was the original depot. You can see it was a big, magnificent structure. This, by the way, was the Harvey House. They always had a restaurant. The Harvey House was always built next to the depot, and it was a restaurant that was a big deal throughout the United States. People went there for Sunday dinners. It was kind of one of the premier restaurants. And, a lot of young women worked at the Harvey House. It was one of the few places that seemed to be acceptable for women to work as maids and attendants. This was the railroad depot that originally replaced the one I just showed you. This was built in 1926. That railroad depot, the one I just showed you, had begun to deteriorate. And so they built this railroad depot, which remained in existence until about the 1960s, 70s. As you can see, it was built in the mission style. There was a great deal of interest in Southwestern architecture in the 1920s. And all over Springfield, you can see examples of the mission style architecture. You can see it was built kind of in the realm of the Southwestern mission style. And I can remember as a young child, only time I ever rode the railroad, my mom decided that she wanted to go up to see my Uncle Herschel and his wife, which was her aunt. And she took me with her and she said, let's go. Dad couldn't take us that time. And he said, well, we'll just take the train. And it was only a couple blocks to their house and they'll come get us. So we rode the train about 10 miles. The only time I was ever on a train my whole life. And I can remember getting off at the station and I can remember thinking it was a big deal, folks. I was probably 8 or 9 years old. And that was I thought I was in the big city in America at that time, because a trip to Springfield, even though it was only 10 miles, was a big deal for a small town boy back in these days. And I can remember so clearly getting off at the station and Uncle Herschel coming and picking us up and driving us to 2 blocks to his stately house. And we stayed there for the weekend and visited. Mom visited with her aunt and her uncle. And then Dad came up and picked us up and drove us back home to Republic. But this was a big deal. And so out of all this, of course, as you might imagine, got to be some really wealthy people. And Springfield was no different. Next week, I'm going to tell you the story of Springfield's first millionaire. Now, he is surely not indicative of most Ozarkers, but his story is so unique and so colorful that I think it deserves to be told. His name was John O'Day, and you might imagine he's an Irishman from Limerick, Ireland, of all places. And he was, first of all, the lawyer for the Frisco Railroad for several decades. And then he became a vice president, and eventually he was the president of the Frisco Railroads in the late 1800s. And he ended up marrying, and that's a story I'll tell you next week. But the bottom line is he built an iconic summer house for his wife out in the country of Springfield. Now that's downtown Springfield. Again, if you're familiar with Springfield, it's right in the middle. It's just surrounded now by different shopping centers, and it's just right downtown Springfield. But he built it's called Effendale. Still stands. It's now a bed and breakfast and a wedding venue. But it's such a great story. I want to tell it next week. So next week we'll talk about John O'Day and the building of the Effendale Mansion.
Okay.
So, hello, Donna.
Hi there.
Good job.